Good evening. Evening Wars Decline and Fall, Part 2. Chapter 6. Conduct. Sitting over the common room fire that afternoon, waiting for the bell for tea, Paul found himself reflecting that on the whole, last week had not been quite as awful as he had expected. As Beast Chetwynd had told him, he was a distinct success with his form. After the first day, an understanding had been established between them. It was tacitly agreed that when Paul wished to read or write letters, he was allowed to do so undisturbed, while he left them to employ the time as they thought best. When Paul took it upon him to talk to them about their lessons, they remained silent, and when he set them work to do, some of it was done. It had rained steadily, so that there had been no games. No punishments, no reprisals, no exertion, and in the evenings the confessions of Grimes, any one of which would have glowed with outstanding shamelessness, from the appendix to a treatise in sexual psychology. Mr. Prendergast came in with the post. "A letter for you, 2 for Grimes, nothing for me," he said. "No one ever writes to me. There was a time when I used to get 5 or 6 letters a day, not counting circulars. My mother used to file them for me to answer. One heap of charity appeals, another for personal letters, another for marriages and funerals, another for baptisms and churchings, and another for anonymous abuse. I wonder why it is the clergy always get so many letters of that sort. Sometimes from quite educated people. I remember my father had great trouble in that way once, and he was forced to call in the police because they became so threatening. And do you know, it was the curate's wife that had sent them. Such a quiet little woman. There's your letter, Grimes. Looks like bills. I can't think why shops give that man credit at all." "I always pay cash," said Paul. "Yes, so do I. Or at least I should if I ever bought anything. But do you know that except for my tobacco and the Daily News and occasionally a little port when it's very cold, I don't think I've bought anything for 2 years. The last thing I bought was that walking stick. I got it at Shanklin, and Grimes uses it for beating the boys with. I hadn't really meant to buy one, but I was there for the day 2 years ago this August, and I went into the tobacconist to buy some tobacco. He hadn't the sort I wanted, and I felt I couldn't go without getting something, so I bought that. Cost 1 and 6, he added wistfully, so I had no tea." Paul took his letter. It had been forwarded from Onslow Square. On the flap were embossed the arms of Scone College. It was from one of his 4 friends. "Scone College, Junior Common Room, Oxford. My dear Pennyfeather," it ran. I need hardly tell you how distressed I was when I heard of your disastrous misfortune. It seems to me that a real injustice has been done to you. I have not heard the full facts of the case, but I was confirmed in my opinion by a very curious incident last evening. I was just going to bed when Digby Vane Trumpington came into my rooms without knocking. He was smoking a cigar. I had never spoken to him before, as you know, and was very much surprised at his visit. He said, "I'm told you're a friend of Pennyfeather's." I said I was, and he said, "Well, I gather I've got him into a mess." I said yes, and he said, "Well, will you apologize for him when you write?" I said I would, and then he said, "Look here, I'm told he's rather poor. I thought of sending him some money, £20 for sort of damages, you know. It's all I can spare at the moment." Wouldn't it be a useful thing to do? I fairly let him have it, I can tell you, and told him just what I thought of him for making such an insulting suggestion. I asked him how he dared treat a gentleman like that, just because he wasn't in his awful set. He seemed rather taken aback, and said, "Well, all of my friends spend all their time trying to get money out of me," and went off. I bicycled over to St. Magnus's at Little Beckley and took some rubbings of the brasses there. I wished you'd been with me. Yours, Arthur Potts. P.S. I understand you're thinking of taking up educational work. It seems to me that the great problem of education is to train the moral perceptions, not merely to discipline the appetites. I cannot help thinking that it is in great fastidiousness, rather than in greater self-control, that the future progress of the race lies. I should be interested to hear what your experience has been of the matter. The chaplain does not agree with me in this. He says great sensibility usually leads to innovation of will. Let me know what you think. What do you think about that? Asked Paul, handing Mr. Prendergast the letter. Well, he said after studying it carefully, I think your friend is wrong about sensibility. It doesn't do to rely on one's own feelings, does it? Not in anything. No, I mean about the money. Oh, good gracious, Pennyfeather. I hope you're in no doubt about that. Accept it at once, of course. It's a temptation. My dear boy, it would be a sin to refuse. £20! Why, it takes me half a term to earn that. The bell rang for tea. In the dining hall, Paul gave the letter to Grimes. Shall I take the £20? He asked. Take it? My God, I should think you would. Well, I'm not sure, said Paul. He thought about it all through afternoon school, all the time he was dressing for dinner, and all through dinner. It was a severe struggle, but his early training was victorious. If I take that money, he said to himself, I shall never know whether I have acted rightly or not. It would always be on my mind. If I refuse, I shall be sure of having done right. I shall look back upon my self-denial with exquisite self-approval. By refusing, I can convince myself that, in spite of the unbelievable things that have been happening to me during the last 10 days, I am still the same Paul Pennyfeather I have respected for so long. It is a test case for the durability of my ideals, I think. He tried to explain something of what he felt to Grimes as they sat in Mrs. Roberts' bar parlour that evening. I'm afraid you'll find my attitude rather difficult to understand, he said. I suppose it's largely a matter of upbringing. There is every reason why I should take this money. Digby Vane Trumpington is exceedingly rich, and if he keeps it, it will undoubtedly be spent on betting or some other deplorable debauch. Owing to his party, I have suffered irreparable harm. My whole future is shattered. I have directly lost £120 a year in scholarships, and £250 a year allowance from my guardian. By any ordinary process of thought, the money is justly mine. But, said Paul Pennyfeather, there is my honour. For generations the British bourgeoisie have spoken of themselves as gentlemen, and by that they have meant, among other things, a self-respecting scorn of irregular perquisites. It is the quality that distinguishes the gentleman from both the artist and the aristocrat. Now, I am a gentleman. I can't help it. It's born in me. I just can't take the money." "Well, I'm a gentleman too, old boy," said Grimes, "and I was afraid you might feel like this, so I did my best for you, and I saved you from yourself." "Oh, what do you mean by that?" "Dear old boy, don't be angry, but immediately after tea I sent off a wire to your friend Potts. 'Tell Trumpington send the money quick,' and signed it Pennyfeather. I don't mind lending you the bob until it comes, either." "Grimes, you wretch!" said Paul, but in spite of himself he felt a great wave of satisfaction surge up within him. "We must have another drink on that." "Good for you," said Grimes, "and it's on me this round." "To the durability of ideals," said Paul, as he got his pint. "My word, what a mouthful," said Grimes. "I can't say that. Cheerio." 2 days later came another letter from Arthur Potts. "Dear Pennyfeather, I enclose Trumpington's cheque for £20. I am glad that my dealings with him are at an end. I cannot pretend to understand your attitude in this matter, but no doubt you are the best judge. Stiggins is reading a paper to the OSCU on sex repression and religious experience. Everyone expects rather a row because you know how keen Walton is on the mystical element, which I think Stiggins is inclined to discount. Yours, Arthur Potts. There is a most interesting article in the Educational Review on the new methods that are being tried at the Innesborough High School to induce coordination of the senses. They put small objects into children's mouths and make them draw shapes in red chalk. Have you tried this with your boys? I must say I envy your opportunities. Are your colleagues enlightened?" "This same Potts," said Grimes, as he read the letter, "would appear to be something of a stinker. Still, we've got the doings. How about a binge?" "Well, yes," said Paul. "I think we ought to do something about one. I should like to ask Prendy, too." "Why, of course, it's just what Prendy needs. He's been looking awfully down in the mouth lately. Why shouldn't we all go over to the Metropole at Cwmprithig for dinner one night? We shall have to wait until the old boy goes away, otherwise he'll notice there's no one on duty." Later in the day, Paul suggested the plan to Mr. Prendergrass. "Really, Pennyfeather?" he said. "I think that's uncommonly kind of you. I hardly know what to say. Of course, I should love it, but I can't remember when I dined at a hotel last. Certainly not since the war. It will be a treat. Oh, dear boy, I'm quite overcome." And much to Paul's embarrassment, a tear welled up in each of Mr. Prendergast's eyes and coursed down his cheeks. Chapter 7. Philbrick. That morning, just before luncheon, the weather began to show signs of clearing, and by 1:30 the sun was shining. The doctor made one of his rare visits to the school dining hall. At his entry, everybody stopped eating and laid down his fork and knife. "Boys," the doctor, regarding them benignly, said, "I have an announcement to make. Clutterbuck, you will kindly stop eating while I am addressing the school." "The boys' manners need correcting, Mr. Prendergast. I look to the prefects to see to this." "Boys, the chief sporting event of the year will take place in the playing fields tomorrow. I refer to the annual school sports day, unfortunately postponed last year owing to the general strike. Mr. Pennyfeather, who, as you know, is himself a distinguished athlete, will be in charge of all arrangements. The preliminary heats will be run off today. All boys must compete in all events. The Countess of Circumference has kindly consented to present the prizes. Mr. Prendergast will act as referee, and Captain Grimes as timekeeper. I shall myself be present tomorrow to watch the final competitions. That is all. Thank you. Mr. Pennyfeather, perhaps you will favour me with an interview when you have finished your luncheon." "Good God," murmured Paul. "I won the long jump at the last sports day," said Briggs, "but everyone said that was because I had spiked shoes. Do you wear spiked shoes, sir?" "Invariably," said Paul. "Everyone said it was taking an unfair advantage, you see. We never know beforehand when there's going to be sports day, so we don't have time to get ready, you see." "My mamma's coming down to see me tomorrow," said Beast Chetwynd. "Just my luck. Now I shall have to stay here all afternoon." After luncheon, Paul went to the morning-room, where he found the doctor pacing up and down in evident high excitement. Ah, come in, Pennyfeather. I'm just making the arrangements for tomorrow's fete. Florence, will you get on to the Clutterbucks on the telephone and ask them to come over, and the Hope Browns? I think the Warringtons are too far away, but you might ask them, and, of course, the Vicar and old Colonel Sidebottom. The more guests the better, Florence. Diana, you must arrange the tea, sandwiches, foie gras sandwiches. The last time, you remember, the liver sausage you brought made Lady Bunyan ill. And cakes, plenty of cakes, with coloured sugar. You'd better take the car into Llandudno and get them. Philbrick, there must be a champagne cup. And will you help the men putting up the marquee? And flags, Diana, there should be flags left over from last time. I made them into dusters, said Dingy. Well, we must buy some more. No expense must be spared. Pennyfeather, I want you to get the results of the first heats out by 4 o'clock. Then you can telephone them to the printers, and we shall have the programmes by tomorrow. Tell them that 50 will be enough. They must be decorated with the school colours and crest in gold. And there must be flowers, Diana, banks of flowers, said the doctor with an expansive gesture. The prizes shall stand amongst banks of flowers. Do you think there ought to be a bouquet for Lady Circumference? No, said Dingy. Oh, nonsense, said the doctor. Of course there must be a bouquet. It is rarely that the scholarly calm of Llanaba gives place to festival. But when it does, taste and dignity shall go unhampered. It shall be an enormous bouquet, redolent of hospitality. You are to procure the most expensive bouquet that Wales can offer, do you understand? Flowers, youth, wisdom, the glitter of jewels, music, said the doctor, his imagination soaring to dizzying heights under the stimulus of the words. Music! There must be a band. I've never heard of such a thing, said Dingy. A band indeed. You'll be having fireworks next. And fireworks, said the doctor. And do you think it would be a good thing to buy Mr. Prendergast a new tie? I've noticed how shabby he looked this morning. No, said Dingy with finality. That is going too far. Flowers and fireworks are one thing, but I insist on drawing a line somewhere. It would be sinful to buy Mr. Prendergast a tie. Perhaps you're right, said the doctor. But there shall be music. I understand that the Llanaba Silver Band was third in the North Wales Eisteddfod last month. Will you get on to them, Florence? I think Mr. Davies at the station is the bandmaster. Can the Clutterbucks come? Yes, said Flossie, 6 of them. Admirable. And then there is the press. We must ring up the Flint and Denby Herald and get them to send a photographer. That means whiskey. Will you see to that, Philbrick? I remember at one of our sports I omitted to offer whiskey to the press, and the result was a most unfortunate photograph. Boys do get into such indelicate positions during the obstacle race, don't they? And then there are the prizes. I think you'd better take Grimes into Llandudno with you to help with the prizes. I don't think there's any need for undue extravagance with the prizes. It gives the boys the wrong idea of sport. I wonder whether Lady Circumference would think it odd if we asked her to present parsley crowns. And perhaps she would. Utility, economy, and apparent durability are the qualities to be sought for, I think. And Pennyfeather, I hope you will see that they are distributed fairly evenly about the school. It doesn't do to let any boy win more than 2 events. I leave you to arrange that. I think it would be only right if little Lord Tangent won something, and Beast Chetwynd, yes, his mother is coming down too. I'm afraid all this has been thrown upon your shoulders rather suddenly. I only learned this morning that Lady Circumference proposed to visit us, and as Mrs. Beast Chetwynd was coming too, it seemed too good an opportunity to be missed. It is not often that the visits of 2 such important parents coincide. She is the Honourable Mrs. Beast Chetwynd, you know, sister-in-law of Lord Pastmaster, a very wealthy woman, South American. They always say that she poisoned her husband. But of course little Beast Chetwynd doesn't know that. It never came to court, but there was a great deal of talk about it at the time, though. Perhaps you remember the case? No, said Paul. Powdered glass, said Flossie shrilly. In his coffee. Turkish coffee, said Dinny. To work, said the doctor. We have a lot to see to. It was raining again by the time that Paul and Mr. Prendergast reached the playing fields. The boys were waiting them in a bleak little group, shivering at the unaccustomed austerity of bare knees and open necks. Clutterbuck had fallen down in the mud and was crying quietly behind a tree. How shall we divide them? Said Paul. I don't know, said Mr. Prendergast. Frankly, I deplore the whole business. Philbrick appeared in an overcoat and a bowler hat. Mrs. Fagin says she is very sorry, but she's burnt the hurdles and the jumping posts for firewood. She thinks you can hire some in Llandudno for tomorrow. The doctor says you must do your best you can until then. I've got to help the gardeners put up the blasted tent. I think that, if anything, sports are rather worse than concerts, said Mr. Prendergast. At least they happen indoors. Oh dear, how wet I'm getting. I should have got my boots mended if I'd known this was going to happen. Please, sir, said Beast Chetwynd, we're all getting rather cold. Can we start? Yes, I suppose so, said Paul. And what do you want to do? Well, we ought to divide up into heats and then run a race. All right, I'll get into 4 groups. This took some time. They tried to induce Mr. Prendergast to run too. The first race will be a mile. Prendy, will you look after them? I want to see if Philbrick and I can fix anything up for the jumping. But what am I to do? Said Prendergast. Would you just make each group run to the castle and back and take the names of the first 2 in each heat? It's quite simple. I'll try, he said sadly. Paul and Philbrick went to the pavilion together. Me, a butler, said Philbrick, made to put up tents like a blinking Arab. Well, it's a change, said Paul. It's a change for me to be a butler, said Philbrick. I wasn't made to be anyone's servant. No, I suppose not. I expect you wonder how it is I came to be here, said Philbrick. No, said Paul firmly. Nothing of the kind. I don't in the least want to know anything about you, do you hear? I don't want to hear anything about your loathsome confessions. Can't you understand? It isn't a loathsome confession, said Philbrick. It's a story of love. I think it is, without exception, the most beautiful story I know of. I dare say you may have heard of Sir Solomon Philbrick? No, said Paul. What? Never heard of old Solly Philbrick? No. Why? Because that's me. And I can tell you this, it's a pretty well-known name across the river. You've only to say Solly Philbrick of the Lamb and Flag anywhere south of Waterloo Bridge to see what fame is. Try it. I will one day. Mind you, when I say Sir Solomon Philbrick, that's only a bit of fun, see? That's what the boys call me, plain Mr. Solomon Philbrick. I am, really, just like you or him, with a jerk of the thumb towards the playing fields from which Mr. Prendergast's voice could be heard crying weakly, Oh, do get into line, you beastly boys! But Sir Solomon's what they call me, out of respect, you see. When I say, are you ready? Go. I want you to go. Mr. Prendergast could be heard saying, Are you ready? Go. Oh, why don't you go? And the voice became drowned in shrill cries of protest. Mind you, went on Philbrick, I haven't always been in the position I am now. I was brought up rough. Damned rough. Ever heard speak of Chick Philbrick? No, I suppose he was before your time. Useful little boxer, though. Not first class on account of his drinking so much and being short in the arm. Still, he used to earn £5 a night at the Lambeth Stadium. Always popular with the boys he was, even when he was so full. He couldn't hardly fight. But he was my dad. Good-hearted sort of fellow, but rough. As I was telling you, he used to knock my poor mother about something awful. Got jugged for it twice. But he took it out on her when he got out. There aren't many left like him nowadays, what with education and whiskey the price it is. Chick was all for getting me on the sporting world, and before I left school, I was earning a few shillings a week holding the sponge at the stadium on Saturday nights. It was there I met Toby Crutwell. Perhaps you ain't never heard of him neither. No, I'm terribly afraid I haven't. I'm not very well up on sporting characters. Sporting? What, Toby Crutwell, a sporting character? You make me laugh. Toby Crutwell, said Philbrick with renewed emphasis, what brought off the Buller Diamond robbery of 1912 and the Amalgamated Steel Trust robbery of 1910 and the Isle of Wight burglaries in 1914, he wasn't no sporting character. Toby wasn't. Sporting character? Do you know what he's done to Alf Larrigan? What, tried to put it up over on one of his girls? I'll tell you. Toby had a doctor in tow at the time, name of Peterfield. He lives in Harley Street. with a swell lot of patience. Well, Toby knew a thing or two about him. He'd done in one of Toby's girls and went to him because she was going to have a kid. Well, Toby knew that. So he had to do what Toby told him, see? Toby didn't kill Alf. That wasn't his way. Toby never killed no one except a lot of blinking Turks at the time they gave him the VC. But he got hold of him and he shook him to Dr. Peterfield, and Philbrick's voice sank to a whisper. Second heat, get ready. Now, if you don't go when I say go, I shall disqualify you all, do you hear? Are you ready? Go! He hadn't no use for the girl after that. Sporting characters, good. Well, me and Toby worked together for 5 years. I was with him in the Steel Trust and the Buller Diamonds, and we cleared a nice little profit. Toby took 75%, him being the older man, but even with that, I did pretty well. Just before the war, we split. He stuck to safecracking, and I settled down comfortable in the Lamb and Flag, Camberwell Green. Very fine house, that, before the war. It's the best in the locality now, though, I says. Things aren't quite so easy as they were. But I can't complain. I've got the picture house next to it, too. Just mention my name there any day. You like to have a free seat. That's very kind of you. You're welcome. Well then, there was the war. Toby got the VC in the Dardanelles and turned respectable. He's in Parliament now. Major Crutwell, MP, Conservative member for some potty town in the south coast. My old woman ran the pub for me. Didn't I tell you I was married? Did I? Pretty enough bit of goods when we was spliced, but she ran too far. Women do in the public house business. Got fat. After the war, things were a bit slow, and then my old woman kicked the bucket. Didn't think I'd mind much, her having got so fat and all. Nor I didn't at first. But after a time, when the excitement of the funeral had died down and things were going on just the same as usual, I began to get restless. You know how things get. And I took to reading papers. Before that, my old woman used to read out the bits she liked, and sometimes I'd listen and sometimes I wouldn't. But anyhow, they weren't things that interested me. She never took no interest in crime, unless it was a murder. But I took to reading the police news, and I took to dropping in at the pictures whenever they sent me to see a crook film. I didn't sleep so well neither, and I used to lie awake thinking of old times. Of course, I could have got married again. In my position, I could have married pretty well, who I liked, but it wasn't that I wanted. Then one Saturday night, I came at the bar. Generally, I drop in on the Saturday evenings and smoke a cigar and stand around the drinks. Sets the right tone. I wear a buttonhole in the summer too, and a diamond ring. Well, I was in the saloon, and then who do I see in the corner but Jimmy Drage? I used to know him when I was working with Toby Cutwell. I never seen a man looking more discouraged. "Hello, Jimmy," I says. "We don't see each other as often as we used. How are things with you?" I says it cordial, but careful like, because I didn't know what Jimmy was up to. "Pretty bad," said Jimmy. "Just fooled a job." "What sort of job?" I says. "Nobbling," he says, meaning kidnapping. "It was like this," he says. "You know a toff called Lord Utteridge? The bloke what had them electric burglar alarms," I says. "Utteridge House, Belgrove Square? That's the blinking bastard. Well, he's got a son, nasty little kid of about 12, just gone off to college for the first time. I had my eye on him," Jimmy said, "for a long time, him being the only son and his father so rich. So when I'd finished the last job, I was to go on to him. Everything went as easy as drinking," Jimmy said. "There was a garage just around the corner behind Belgrove Square where we used to go every morning to watch them messing about with the cars. Crazy about cars, the kid was. Jimmy comes in one day with his motorbike and sidecar and asks for some petrol. He comes up and looks at it in the way he had. 'That bike's no good,' he says. 'No good?' says Jimmy. 'I wouldn't sell it for 100 quid. I wouldn't.' 'This bike,' he says, 'won the Grand Prix of Boulogne.' 'Nonsense,' the kid says. 'It wouldn't do 30, not downhill.' 'Well, just you see,' Jimmy says. 'Come for a run. I'll bet you it'll do 80 on the road.' In he got, and away they went, till they got to a place Jimmy knew. Then Jimmy shuts him up in a safe and writes to his father. The kid was happy as blazes, taking down the engine of Jimmy's bike. It's never been the same since, Jimmy told me, but then it wasn't much to talk of before. Everything had gone through splendid till Jimmy got his answer from Lord Utteridge. Would you believe it? That unnatural father wouldn't stump up. Him that owns ships and coal mines enough to buy the blinking Bank of England. Said he was much obliged to Jimmy for the trouble he had taken, that the dearest wish of his life had been granted, and the one barrier to his complete happiness removed, but that as the matter had been taken up without his instruction, he did not feel called upon to make any payment in respect of it, and remained sincerely Utteridge. That was one nasty one for Jimmy. He wrote once or twice after that, but got no answer. So by the time the kid had spread the bits of his bike all over his room, Jimmy let him go. Did you try pulling out his teeth and sending him to his pa, I asks. No, says Jimmy, I didn't do that. Did you make the kid write pathetic, asking to be let out? No, says Jimmy, I didn't do that. Did you cut off one of his fingers and put it in a letterbox? No, he says. Well, man alive, I says, you don't deserve to succeed, you just don't know your job. Oh, cut that out, he says. It's easy to talk, you've been out of business 10 years. You don't know what things are like nowadays. Well, that rather set me thinking. As I say, I'd been getting restless, doing nothing but pottering around a pub all day. Look here, I says, I bet you I can bring off a job like that. Any day, any kid you like to mention. Done, says Jimmy. So he opens a newspaper. The first top we find, what's got only a son, he says. Right, says I. Well, about the first thing we found was a picture of Lady Circumference with her only son, Lord Tangent, at Warwick races. There's your man, said Jimmy, and that's what brought me here. But, good gracious, said Paul, why have you told me this monstrous story? I shall certainly inform the police. I never heard of such a thing. That's all right, said Philbrick. The job's off. Jimmy's won his bet. All this was before I met Dina, see? Dina? Miss Diana. Dina, I calls her, after a song I heard. The moment I saw that girl, I knew the game was up. My heart just stood still. There's a song about that too, that girl, said Philbrick. Could bring a man up from the depths of hell itself. You feel as strongly that about her? I'd go through fire and water for that girl. She's not happy here. I don't think her dad treats her proper. Sometimes, said Philbrick, I think she's only marrying me to get away from here. Good heavens, are you going to get married? We fixed it up last Thursday. We've been going together for some time. It's bad for a girl being shut away like that, never seeing a man. She was in a state she'd have gone with anybody until I come along. Just housekeeping day in, day out. The only pleasure she ever got was cutting down the bills and dismantling and dismissing the servants. Most of them leave before their month is up anyway. They're that hungry. She's got a head on her shoulders. She has real businesswoman. That's just what I need at the Lamb. Then she heard me on the phone one day giving instructions to our manager at the picture theatre. That made her think a bit. A prince in disguise, as you might say. If it was she who actually suggested our getting married. I shouldn't have had the face to, not while I was a butler. What I'd meant to do was to hire a car one day and come down with my diamond ring and my buttonhole and pop the question, but there wasn't any need for that. Love's a wonderful thing. Philbrick stopped speaking and was evidently deeply moved by his recital. The door of the pavilion opened, and Mr. Prendergast came in. Well, said Paul, how are the sports going? Not very well, said Mr. Prendergast. In fact, they've all gone. All over? Yes, you see, none of the boys came back from the first race. They just disappeared behind the tree at the top of the drive. I expect they've gone to change. I don't blame them. I'm sure it's terribly cold. Still, it was discouraging launching heat after heat, and none of them coming back. Like sending troops into battle, you know. The best thing for us to do is to go back and change too. Yes, I suppose so. Oh, what a day. Grimes was in the common room. Just back from the gay metropolis of Llandudno, he said. Shopping with dinghy. It's not a seemly occupation for a public school man. How did the heats go? There weren't any, said Paul. Quite right, said Grimes. You leave this to me. I've been in this trade some time. These things are best done over the fire. We can make out the results in peace. We'd better hurry. The old boy wants them sent to the printers this evening. And taking a sheet of paper and a small stub of pencil, Grimes made out the programme. How about that? He said. Well, Clutterbuck seems to have done pretty well, said Paul. Yes, he's a splendid little athlete, said Grimes. Now, just you telephone that through to the printers and they'll get it done tonight. I wonder if we ought to have a hurdle race. No, said Mr. Prendergast. Chapter 8. The Sports. Happily enough, it did not rain the next day, and after morning school, everybody dressed up to the nines, Dr. Fagin appeared in a pale grey morning coat and sponge-bag trousers, looking more than ever jeune première. There was a spring in his step and a pronounced sprightliness of bearing that Paul had not observed before. Flossie wore a violet frock of knitted wool, made for her during the preceding autumn by her sister. It was the colour of indelible ink on blotting paper, and was ornamented at the waist with flowers of emerald green and pink. Her hat, also homemade, was the outcome of many winter evenings of ungrudged labour. All the trimmings of all her previous hats had gone into its adornment. Dingy wore a little steel brooch made in the shape of a bulldog. Grimes wore a stiff evening collar of celluloid. "Had to do something to celebrate the occasion," he said, "so I put on a choker. Phew, though, it's tight. Have you seen my fiancée's latest creation? Ascot, ain't it? Let's get down to Mrs. Roberts for a quick one before the happy throng rolls up. I wish I could, but I've got to go round the ground with the doctor. Righto, old boy, see you later. Here comes Prendy in his coat of many colours." Mr. Prendergast wore a blazer of faded stripes which smelled strongly of camphor. "I think Dr. Fagin encourages a certain amount of display on these occasions," he said. "I used to keep wicket for my college, you know, but I was too short-sighted to be much good. Still, I am entitled to the blazer," he said with a note of defiance in his voice, "and it is more appropriate to a sporting occasion than a stiff collar." "Good old Prendy," said Grimes. "Nothing like a change of clothes to bring out latent pep. I feel that my first week in khaki. Well, so long, me for Mrs. Roberts. Why don't you come too, Prendy?" "Do you know," said Mrs. Brown, "I think I will." Paul watched them disappear down the drive in amazement. Then he went off to find the doctor. "Frankly," said the doctor, "I am at a loss to understand my own emotions. I can think of no entertainment that fills me with greater detestation than a display of competitive athletics. None, except possibly folk dancing. If there are two women in the world whose company I abominate, and there are very many more than two, they are Mrs. Beast Chetwynd and Lady Circumference. I have, moreover, an extremely difficult encounter with my butler this morning, who, will you believe it, waited at luncheon in a mustard-coloured suit of +4s and a diamond tie pin. And when I reprimanded him, attempted to tell me some ridiculous story about being the proprietor of a circus or swimming bath or some such concern. And yet," said the doctor, "I am filled with a wholly delightful exhilaration. I can't understand it. It is not as though this was the first occasion of the kind. During the 14 years that I have been at Llanabba, there have been 6 sport days and 2 concerts. All of them, in one way or another, utterly disastrous. Once Lady Bunyan was taken ill. Another time it was the matter of the press photographers at the obstacle race. Another time some quite unimportant parents brought a dog with them which bit 2 of the boys very severely, and one of the masters, who swore terribly in front of everyone. I could hardly blame him, but of course he had to go. Then there was the concert where the boys refused to sing God Save the Queen because of the pudding they had had for luncheon. One way or another I have been consistently unfortunate in my efforts at festivity, and yet I look forward to each new fiasco with utmost relish. Perhaps, Pennyfeather, you will bring good luck to Llanabba. In fact, I feel confident you have already done so. Look at the sun." Picking their way carefully among the dry patches in the waterlogged drive, they reached the playing fields. Here, the haphazard organisation of the last 24 hours seemed to have been fairly successful. A large marquee was already in position, and Philbrick, still in +4s, and 3 gardeners were at work putting up a smaller tent. "That's for the Llanabba Silver Band," said the doctor. "Philbrick, I require you to take off those loathsome garments." "They were new when I bought them," said Philbrick, "and they cost £8.15. Anyhow, I can't do 2 things at once, can I? If I go back and change, who's going to manage all this, I'd like to know." "All right, finish what you're doing first. Let us just review the arrangements. The marquee is for the visitors' tea. That is Diana's province. I expect we shall find her at work." Sure enough, there was Dingy helping two servants to arrange plates of highly coloured cakes down a trestle table. Two other servants in the background were cutting sandwiches. Dingy, too, was obviously enjoying herself. "Jane, Emily, remember that the butter has to do for 3 loaves. Spread it thoroughly, but don't waste it. And cut the crusts as thin as possible. Father, will you see to it that the boys who come in with their parents come in alone? You remember last time how Briggs brought in 4 boys with him and they ate all the jam sandwiches before Colonel Loder had had any? Mr. Pennyfeather, this champagne cup is not for the masters. In fact, I expect you will find yourself too much occupied helping the visitors to have any tea until they have all left the tent. You'd better tell Captain Grimes that too. I'm sure Mr. Prendergast would not think of pushing himself forward." Outside the marquee were assembled several seats and tubs of palms and flowering shrubs. "All this must be set in order," said the doctor. "Our guests may arrive in less than an hour." He passed on. "The cars shall turn aside from the drive here and come right into the ground. It will give a pleasant background to the photographers. And, Pennyfeather, if you would with tact direct the photographer so that more prominence is given to Mrs. Beast Chetwynd's Hispano Suiza than to Lady Circumference's little motor car, I think it would be all to the good. All these things count, you know." "Nothing seems to have been done about marking the ground," said Paul. "No," said the doctor, turning to the field for the first time. "Nothing. Well, you must do the best you can." "Well, they can't do everything." "I wonder if the hurdles have come." "They were ordered," said the doctor. "I am certain of it. Philbrick, have any hurdles come?" "Yes," said Philbrick with a low chuckle. "Why, pray, why do you laugh at the mention of hurdles?" "Oh, just look at them," said Philbrick. "They're behind the tea-house there." Paul and the doctor went to look and found a pile of spiked iron railings in sections, heaped up at the back of the marquee. They were each about 5 feet high and were painted with green gilt spikes. "Seems to me that they've sent the wrong sort," said the doctor. "Yes. Well, we must do the best we can. What other things ought there to be?" "Weight, hammer, javelin, long jump pit, high jump posts, low hurdles, eggs, spoons, greasy pole," said Philbrick. "Previously competed for," said the doctor imperturbably. "What else?" "Somewhere to run," suggested Paul. "Why, God bless my soul, they've got the whole park here. How did you manage yesterday for the heats?" We judged the distance by eye." "Well, then that is what we shall have to do today. Really, my dear Pennyfeather, it is quite unlike you to fabricate difficulties in this way. I'm afraid you're getting unnerved. Let them go on racing until it is time for tea, and remember," he added sagely, "the longer the race, the more time it takes. I leave the details to you. I am concerned with style. I wish, for instance, that we had a starting pistol." "Would this be any use?" said Philbrick, producing an enormous service revolver. "Only take care it's loaded." "The very thing," said the doctor. "Only fire into the ground, mind. We must do everything we can to avoid an accident. Do you always carry that about with you?" "Only when I'm wearing my diamonds," said Philbrick. "Well, I hope it's not too often. Good gracious. Who are these extraordinary-looking people?" 10 men of revolting appearance were approaching from the drive. They were low of brow, crafty of eye, and crooked of limb. They advanced, huddled together, with the loping tread of wolves, peering about them furtively as they came, as though in constant terror of ambush. They slavered at their mouths, which hung loosely over their receding chins, while each clutched under his ape-like arm a burden of curious and unaccountable shape. On seeing the doctor they halted and edged back, those behind squinting and mouthing over their companions' shoulders. "Crikey!" said Philbrick. "Loonies! This is where I shoot." "I refuse to believe the evidence of my eyes," said the doctor. "These creatures simply do not exist." After a brief preliminary shuffling and nudging, an elderly man emerged from the back of the group. He had a rough black beard and wore on his uneven shoulders a druidical wreath of brass mistletoe berries. "Why, it's my friend the station master," said Philbrick. "We are the Silver Band. The Lord bless and keep you," said the station master in one breath. "The band that no one could beat, whatever, but two indeed in the Eye Stedford, that for all North Wales was looked you." I see, said the doctor. I see. That's splendid. Well, will you go into the tent, the little tent over there? To march about like that? Would you not like us? Suggested the station master. We have a fine yellow flag. Look, that you embroidered for us was in silks. No, into the tent. The station master went back to consult with his fellow musicians. There was a baying and a growling and yapping of the jungle at moonrise, and presently he came forward again with an obsequious sidelong shuffle. £3 you pay us, would you? You said at the sports play. Yes, that's right. £3 into the tent. Nothing whatever. We can play without money first, said the station master firmly. How would it be, said Philbrick, if I gave him a clouty ear? No, I beg you, do nothing of the kind. You have not lived in Wales as long as I have. He took a note-case from his pocket, the sight of which seemed to galvanize the musicians into life. They crowded round, twitching and chattering. The doctor took out £3 notes and gave them to the station master. There you are, Davies, he said. Now, take your men to the tent. They are on no account to emerge until after tea. Do you understand? The band slunk away, and Paul and the doctor turned back to the castle. The Welsh character is an interesting study, said Dr. Fagin. I have often considered writing a little monograph on the subject, but I was afraid it might make me unpopular in the village. The ignorant speak of them as Celts, which is, of course, wholly erroneous. They are of pure Iberian stock, the original inhabitants of Europe, who survive only in Portugal and the Basque districts. Celts readily intermarry with their neighbours and absorb them. From the earliest times, the Welsh have been looked upon as an unclean people. It is thus that they have preserved their racial integrity. Their sons and daughters mate freely with the sheep, but not with humankind except their own blood relations. In Wales there was no need for legislation to prevent the conquering people intermarrying with the conquered, you see. In Ireland that was necessary, for their intermarriage was a political matter. In Wales it was a moral one. I hope, by the way, you have no Welsh blood. None whatever, said Paul. I was sure you had not, but one cannot be too careful. I once spoke about this subject to the sixth form, and learned later that one of them had a Welsh grandmother. I'm afraid it hurt his feelings terribly, poor little chap. She came from Pembrokeshire too, which is, of course, a quite different matter. I often think, he continued, that we can trace almost all disasters of English history to the Welsh, and the influence of Wales. Think of Edward of Carnarvon, the first Prince of Wales. A perverse life, Pennyfeather, and an unseemly death. And then the Tudors and the dissolution of the church, and then Lloyd George and the temperance movement. Nonconformity and lust stalking hand in hand through the country, wasting and ravaging. But you think I exaggerate, I'm sure, yes. I have a certain rhetorical tendency, I admit. No, said Paul. The Welsh, said the doctor, are the only nation in the world that has produced no graphic or plastic art, no architecture, no drama. They just sing, he said with disgust. Sing and blow down wind instruments of plated silver. They are deceitful because they cannot discern the truth from falsehood, depraved because they cannot discern the consequences of their indulgence. Let us consider, he continued, the etymological derivations of the Welsh language. But here he was interrupted by a breathless little boy who panted down the drive to meet them. Please, sir, Lord and Lady Circumference have arrived, sir. They're in the library with Miss Florence. She asked me to tell you. The sports will start in 10 minutes, said the doctor. Run and tell the other boys to change and go at once to the playing fields. I will talk to you about the Welsh again. It is a matter which I have given some thought to, and I can see that you are most sincerely interested. Come in with me and see the Circumferences. Flossie was talking to them in the library. Yes, isn't this a sweet colour? She was saying. I do like something bright myself. Diana made it for me. She does knit a treat. But of course, I chose the colour, you know. You see, Diana's taste is all for wishy-washy greys and browns. Mournful, you know. Well, here's the dad. Lady Circumference was just saying how much she likes my frock. What you said was vulgar, so there. a stout elderly woman in a tweed coat and skirts, and a jaunty Tyrolean hat, advanced to the doctor. "Hello," she said, in deep bass voice. "How are you? Sorry if we're late. Circumference ran over a fool of a boy. I've just been chaffing your daughter here about her frock. I wish I was young enough to wear that kind of thing. The older I get, the more I like colour. We're both pretty long in the tooth, eh?" She gave Dr. Faggot a hearty shake of the hand. That obviously caused him acute pain. She turned to Paul. "So, you're the doctor's hired assassin, eh? Well, I hope you keep a firm hand on my toad of a son. How's he doing?" "Quite well," said Paul. "Nonsense," said Lady Circumference. "The boy's a dunderhead. If he wasn't, he wouldn't be here. He wants beating and hitting and knocking about generally, and then he'll be no good. That grass is shaking bad on the terrace. Doctor, you ought to sand it down and re-sow it, but you'll have to take the cedar down as well if you ever want it to grow properly. I hate cutting down a tree. It's like losing a tooth, but you have to choose, tree or grass. You can't keep them both. What do you pay your head man?" As she was talking, Lord Circumference had emerged from the shadows and shook Paul's hand. He had a long, fair moustache and large, watery eyes, which reminded Paul a little of Mr. Prendergast. "How do you do?" he said. "Oh, how do you do?" said Paul. "Fond of sport, eh?" he said. "I mean, these sort of sports." "Oh, yes," said Paul. "I think they're good for the boys." "Do you? Do you think that?" said Lord Circumference very earnestly. "You think that they're good for the boys?" "Oh, yes," said Paul. "Don't you?" "Me? Yes. Oh, yes. I think so too. Very good for the boys." "So useful in case of war or anything," said Paul. "Do you think so? Do you really think so? That there's going to be another war, I mean?" "Yes, I'm sure of it, aren't you?" "Yes, of course, I'm sure of it too. And that awful bread, and people coming on to one's own land and telling one what to do with one's own butter and milk, and commandeering one's horses. Oh, yes, all that all over again. My wife shot her hunters rather than let them go into the army. And the girls in breeches on the farm all over again. Who do you think it will be this time?" "The Americans," said Paul stoutly. "No, indeed. I hope not. We had the German prisoners on 2 of our farms. That wasn't so bad. But if they start putting Americans on my land, I shall refuse to stand it. My daughter brought an American down to luncheon the other day. Do you know? Dig it and dung it, said Lady Conference, only it's got to be dug deep, mind. Now, how did your calceolarias do last year?" "I really have no idea," said the doctor. "Flossie, how did our calceolarias do?" "Lovely," said Flossie. "I don't believe a word of it," said Lady Circumference. "Nobody's calceolarias did well last year." "Shall we adjourn to the playing fields?" said the doctor. "I expect they're all waiting for us." Talking cheerfully, the party crossed the hall and went down the steps. "Your drive's awful wet," said Lady Circumference. "I expect there's a blocked pipe somewhere. Sure it isn't sewage." "I was never any use at short distances," said Lord Circumference, as he was saying. "I was always a slow starter. But I was once 18th in the crick at Rugby. We didn't take sport so seriously at the varsity when I was growing up. Everybody rowed." "What college were you at?" "Scone." "Scone, were you? Ever come across a young nephew of my wife's called Alistair Digby Vane Trumpington?" "I just met him," said Paul. "That's very interesting. Greta, Mr. Pennyfeather knows Alistair." "Does he? Well, the boy's doing no good for himself. Got fined £20 the other day, his mother told me. Seemed proud of it. If my brother had been alive, he'd have licked all that out of the young cub. It takes a man to bring up a man." "Yes," said Lord Circumference meekly. "Who else do you know at Oxford? Do you know Freddie Frenchwise?" "No." "Or Tom Obblethwaite, or that young Castleton boy?" "No, I'm afraid not. I had a great friend called Potts." "Potts," said Lady Circumference, and left it at that. All the school and several local visitors were assembled in the field. Grimes stood by himself, looking depressed. Mr. Prendergast, flushed and unusually vivacious, was talking to the vicar. As the headmaster's party came into sight, the Llanaba silver band struck up Men of Harlech. "Shocking noise," commented Lady Circumference graciously. The head prefect came forward and presented her with a programme, beribboned and embossed in gold. Another prefect set a chair for her. She sat down with the doctor next to her, and Lord Circumference on the other side of him. "Pennyfeather," cried the doctor above the band. "Start them racing." Philbrick gave Paul a megaphone. "I found this in the pavilion," he said. "Thought it might be useful." "Who's that extraordinary man?" asked Lady Circumference. "He's the boxing coach and swimming professional," said the doctor. "A finely developed figure, don't you think?" "First race," said Paul through the megaphone. "Under 16's quarter mile." He read out Grimes' list of starters. "What's Tangent doing in this race?" said Lady Circumference. "That boy can't run an inch." The silver band had stopped playing. "The course," said Paul, "starts from the pavilion, goes round that clump of elms." "Beeches," corrected Lady Circumference loudly, "and ends in front of the bandstand. Starter, Mr. Prendergast. Timekeeper, Captain Grimes. I shall say, 'Are you ready?' 1, 2, 3, and then fire. Mr. Prendergast, are you ready? 1—" There was a terrific rapport. "Oh dear, I'm sorry." But the race had begun. Clearly, Tangent was not going to win. He was sitting on the grass crying because he had been wounded in the foot by Mr. Prendergast's bullet. Philbrick carried him, wailing dismally, into the refreshment tent, where Dingy helped him off with his shoe. His heel was slightly grazed. Dingy gave him a large slice of cake, and he hobbled out, surrounded by a sympathetic crowd. "That won't hurt him," said Lady Circumference, "but I think someone ought to remove the pistol from that old man before he does anything serious." "I knew that was going to happen," said Lord Circumference. "A most unfortunate beginning," said the doctor. "Am I going to die?" said Tangent, his mouth full of cake. "For God's sake, look after Prendy," said Grimes in Paul's ear. "The man's as tight as a lord. Whiskey." "First blood to me," said Prendy gleefully. "The last race will be run," said Paul down the megaphone. "Starter, Mr. Philbrick. Timekeeper, Mr. Prendergast. On your marks, get set." Bang went the pistol, this time without disaster. The 6 little boys scampered off through the mud, disappeared behind the beeches, and returned rather more slowly. Captain Grimes and Mr. Prendergast held up a piece of tape. "Well run, sir," shouted Colonel Sidebottom. "Jolly good race." "Captain," said Mr. Prendergast, and, dropping his end of the tape, sauntered over to the colonel. "I can see you're a fine judge of a race, sir. So was I once. So's Grimes, a capital fellow. Grimes, a bounder, you know, but a capital fellow. Bounders can be capital fellows, don't you agree, Colonel Sidebottom? In fact, I'd go further and say that capital fellows are bounders. What do you say to that? I wish you'd stop pulling my arm, Pennyfeather. Colonel Shybottom here and I are just having a most interesting conversation about bounders." The silver band struck up again, and Mr. Prendergast began a little jig, saying, capital fellow, and snapping his fingers. Paul led him to the refreshment tent. "Dingy wants you to help her in there," he said firmly. "And for God's sake, don't come out until you feel better." "Never felt better in my life," said Prendergast indignantly. Capital fellow. "It's not my affair, of course," said Colonel Sidebottom, "but if you ask me, I should say that man's been drinking." "He was talking very excitedly to me," said the vicar, "about some apparatus for warming a church in Worthing, and about the apostolic claims of the Church of Abyssinia. I confess I could not follow him clearly. He seems deeply interested in church matters, though. Are you quite sure he's all right in the head? I have noticed again and again since I've been in the church that lay interest in ecclesiastical matters often prelude insanity." "Drink, pure and simple," said the colonel. "I wonder where he got it. I could do with a spot of whisky." "Quarter mile open," said Paul through his megaphone. Presently the Clutterbucks arrived. Both the parents were stout. They brought with them 2 small children, a governess and an elder son. They debouched from the car, and one by one stretching their limbs in evident relief. "This is Sam," said Mr. Clutterbuck, "just down from Cambridge. He's joined me in the business, and we've brought the nippers along for a treat. Don't mind, do you, Doc? And last but not least, my wife." Dr. Fagin greeted them with genial condescension and found them seats. "I'm afraid you have missed all the jumping events," he said, "but I have a list of the results here. You will see that Percy has done extremely well." "Didn't know the little beggar had it in him. See that, Martha? Percy's won the high jump and the long jump and the hurdles." "How's your young hopeful been doing, Lady Circumference?" "My boy has been injured in the foot," said Lady Circumference coldly. "Dear me, not badly, I hope. Did he twist his ankle in the jumping?" "No," said Lady Circumference. "He was shot by one of the assistant masters, but it is kind of you to inquire." 3 miles open," announced Paul. "The course is 6 laps, will be run as before. On your marks, get set." Bang went Philbrick's revolver. Off trotted the boys on another race. "Father," said Flossie, "don't you think it's time for the tea interval?" "Nothing can be done before Mrs. Beast Chetwynd arrives," said the doctor. Round and round the muddy track trotted the athletes, and while the silver band played sacred music unceasingly. "Last lap," announced Paul. The school and the visitors crowded about the tape to cheer the winner. Amid loud applause, Clutterbuck breasted the tape well ahead of the others. "Well run! Oh, good, jolly good, sir!" cried Colonel Sidebottom. "Good old Percy, that's the stuff," said Mr. Clutterbuck. "Well run, Percy," chorused the 2 little Clutterbucks, prompted by their governess. "That boy cheated," said Lady Comfort. "He only went round 5 times. I counted him." "I think unpleasantness so mars an afternoon," said the vicar. "How dare you suggest such a thing?" suggested Mrs. Clutterbuck. "I appeal to the referee. Percy ran the full course, didn't he?" "Clutterbuck wins," said Captain Grimes. "Fiddlesticks," said Lady Circumference. "He deliberately lagged behind and joined the others as they went round the beaches, the little toad." "Really, Greta," said Lord Circumference, "I think we ought to abide by the referee's decision." "Well, they can't expect me to give away the prizes, then. Nothing would induce me to give that boy a prize." "Do you understand, madam, that you are bringing a serious accusation against my son's honour?" "Serious accusation? Fiddlesticks. What he wants is a jolly good hiding." "No doubt you judge other people's sons by your own. Let me tell you, Lady Circumference, don't attempt to browbeat me, sir. I know a cheat when I see one." At this stage of the discussion, the doctor left Mrs. Hope Brown's side, where he had been remarking upon her son's progress in geometry, and joined the group round the winning post. "If there is a disputed decision," he said gently, "then they shall race again." "Percy has already won," said Mr. Clutterbuck. "He has been adjudged the winner." "Splendid, splendid. A promising athlete. I congratulate you, Clutterbuck." "But he only ran 5 laps, said Lady Circumference. "Well, then clearly he has won the 5 furlong race, a very exacting length." "But the other boys," said Lady Circumference, almost beside herself with own, "have run 6 lengths." "Well, then they," said the doctor imperturbably, "are 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th respectively in 3 miles. Clearly there's been some confusion. Diana, I think we might serve tea now." Things were not easy, but there were, fortunately, distractions. For as he spoke, an enormous limousine of dove grey and silver stole soundlessly onto the field. But what could be more opportune? Here is Mrs. Beast Chetwynd. 3 light skips brought him to the side of the car, but the footman was there before him. The door opened, and from the cushions within emerged a tall young man in a clingy dove-grey overcoat. After him, like the first breath of spring on the Champs-Elysees, came Mrs. Beast Chetwynd. 2 lizard-skin feet, silk legs, chinchilla body, a tight little black hat, pinned with platinum and diamonds, and the high, invariable voice that may be heard at any Ritz hotel from New York to Budapest. "I hope you don't mind my bringing Chokey, Dr. Fagin," she said. "He's just crazy about sports." "I sure am that," said Chokey. "Dear Mrs. Beast Chetwynd," said Dr. Fagin. Dear Mrs. Beast Chetwynd." He pressed her glove, and for a moment he was at a loss for words. For Chokey, though graceful of bearing and irreproachably dressed, was coal black.